Before we jump right into this case, I just want to say that this video is sponsored by, let me stop, I'm just kidding. Welcome back to my channel. So we are still doing the Thanksgiving murder cases, and so we're just jumping right into this case today because it is a lot. In this case today, we are going to be talking about a case that I have never heard of before researching it. And apparently it happened in Australia. Maybe that's why. But it was huge when it first happened. And that is the killings of Katherine Mary Knight. So Katherine Mary Knight was born on October 24th, 1955. And she was born to her parents, Barbara Rogan and father Ken Knight. And at the time Barbara met Ken, she had actually been married to someone else. She had 4 sons with whom she shared with her husband, who was a Scottish native, and his name was John Jack Rogan. So John and Barbara resided in this little small town located in Aberdeen. This was in the North South Wales of Hunter Valley, and their marriage had actually fell apart after Barbara began to have an affair with one of John's co-workers. And this co-worker happened to be Kenneth Ken Knight, who would later become the father of her daughters. And so after Barbara's marriage had actually fell apart, her and Ken continued on a relationship, and because they were in such a small town, word was getting around pretty fast. So the entire town basically knew what happened, and they basically shunned Barbara for her choices, and the couple decided to move away. With the split going on between their parents, the boys had actually decided to stay with their father, and so 2 of the eldest had actually stayed to continue living with their dad, and the 2 youngest had actually went to go reside with their aunt. Barbara then went on to have an additional 4 children who was fathered by Kenneth. So Katherine was also a twin, so it was 2, and then she had 2 more children, so 8 in all. And so 4 years later, after Barbara leaves and she basically starts an entire new family, her first husband had actually passed away, and so her 2 boys had to come and live with her. Remember, the other 2 was residing with the aunt, and so the ones that was residing with the dad actually came to live with Ken and Barbara. Ken was very toxic, and he would get very violent when he was drinking, and he would actually rape Barbara up to 10 times a day. And she most likely did not have any girlfriends or anything to tell, because she would go ahead and actually confide in her daughters about the details of what was happening. She would tell them how much she hated men and how much she loathed sex. And one time when Katherine had actually brought up the fact that she was pretty uncomfortable when one of her partners had been asking her to perform a certain sexual act, and her mother was basically saying stop complaining, shut up and just take it. And all that trauma basically that Barbara had endured made it merely impossible for her to go ahead and show any kind of sympathy to her daughter. It had also been stated by Katherine that she endured a lot of sexual trauma, sexual abuse by several of her family members. And this occurred all the way up until she was about 11 years old. Now, a lot of people feel like these claims are just basically untrue, but it had actually been confirmed by her psychiatrist and by a couple of her family members. Katherine began to, become different and basically shy off from her morals when she got to high school. And she basically just became this bully. She had been attending Muswell Brook High School, and the little bit of time that she did spend there, it was hell. She gave hell. She was putting her hands on the students, and it did not stop there. She was also putting her hands on the teachers, so much so that one of the teachers had actually had to defend themselves and hit her back. But outside of Katherine's delinquent behavior, she was actually academically a good student, very smart, receiving remarkable grades in school. But she did not stay long though, leaving at the age of 15 to go ahead and work at a cutter factory. A year later, she left that job and actually landed what she called her dream job. She began working with this company called Allfowl, and I had to go ahead and look it up because I was completely confused as to what that was and what she was going to be doing. It's not the company, it's the meat that she was cutting up was called Allfowl, but that's basically just organ meat. According to Wikipedia, this was the internal organs of butchered animals. And while working at this job, she had actually received a lot of promotions because, on the contrary, she was really, really good at her job. And they had even gifted her like this butcher knife set or whatever, and she was very proud of this, so much so she hung it over her bed for whatever reason. Personally, I would never, but that's what she did. I truly, honestly do not feel like I would sleep normally knowing that there's a knife set over my head. She did this everywhere she went, no matter where she moved. That was like a sort of ritual for her. She was just known as this like hardcore lady who, whoever pissed her off, she would hit you. And so we are in the year of 1986, and Katherine meets a guy. He's 38 years old, and he's working as a miner at the time. Katherine is like, yes, I hit the jackpot. This is what she's thinking. And things are really kicking up between the two, so much so that David decides to move in with Katherine and her girls. And so it's just her and her girls at first, and then this random man just comes and, you know, moves in with her. Although he was living with Katherine, he still did keep his own apartment. Katherine was very, very, very insecure when it came to her man. She was always questioning him about what he had been doing when she was not around, and eventually she just got fed up and she broke up with him. And so it's actually really, really good that he kept his apartment, and so he moved right back at home. But it had become a cycle to where every time he would leave, she would just beg him basically to come back. And another sick thing, you guys, David had this like puppy, this dingo puppy or whatever, and it was only 2 months old, a baby. Do you know this lady Katherine put a knife to his throat and actually cut his throat right in front of David at that. Now, her reasoning for this was because she wanted to show him what would happen if he had ever stepped out on her. Like the dog, really. And after that, she then proceeds to go ahead and hit him in the head with a frying pan. In June of the year 1988, Katherine had actually gave birth to her third daughter, whom she named Sarah. And David was basically like, okay, our family is increasing. We need to increase our home. And so he went ahead and he put a down payment on a home for them. A year later, Katherine had actually received a workers' compensation check, and she went ahead and put that towards paying off the house. She had also used some of that money to go ahead and basically renovate it as well, and she put all these different decorations in the home, like animal skins all over, skulls, horns, rusty animal traps, just things like that. It was packed. And Katherine had been very, very, very abusive to David. During arguments, she would hit this man with an iron. She one time stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors and had even been destroying his property. After that, David was basically just done with her over all of the toxicness, and he went into hiding. Now, Katherine, of course, tries to find his ass, but she failed. She was asking around to people that they knew, and they were like, nah, we didn't see him. But eventually, David had to return, not for Katherine, but so he can go ahead and see his daughters. But when he came, he did run into some major issues caused by Katherine. Can you guess what that was? Katherine had actually called the police on David previous to this and told the police that she was afraid of him. And because of that, the police had went ahead and granted her a AVO, which is an apprehended violence order. And that's kind of sort of pretty much where their story ends. And so again, Katherine is newly single, and this follows after her toxic breakup with David. She actually begins to start taking a liking to a man which she worked with at the factory where she would be cutting the organ meat. And this man's name was John Chillingworth. And so in 1991, she ends up getting pregnant by him, and boom, 9 months later, a baby boy. They ended up naming this baby boy Eric, and in 1995, so just 3 years after his birth, the parents had actually split. And the split had actually been the cause of Katherine's infidelity, and she had actually started to have an affair with a man that she had met at work. So just a little similar situation that happened with her mother, and basically how she met her father. John Charles Price was born on April 4th, 1955. Before meeting Katherine, he had actually fathered 3 children from a previous relationship. And that little family dynamic had actually ended due to him having an affair with Katherine. So not only Katherine was involved at the time, but so was Mr. Price as well. Side note, but the irony of her actually finding a man with the same name as John is like really funny to me. And not only did you actively cheat on him, but you're actively cheating on him with a man with a similar name. Like, tactically, because, you know, in her phone, she can put, like, the same name, but, like, I'm not condoning it. I'm not condoning it. Moving on, John Price was described as a pretty decent man from multiple accounts. And when his marriage split in 1988, just like Katherine and her mother's previous husband, they had actually split custody. And so Mr. Price's 2-year-old lived with the mother, and his other 2 children decided to reside with him. And so despite him knowing about her past or whatever, he basically disregarded that, and I guess he really truly liked her and the girls liked her, and so he just let this random lady move in with him and his daughters, of course along with her children. And so they went ahead and they moved in with each other in the year of 1995, and at this time Mr. Price was working in the mine, and according to multiple sources, things were seeming pretty okay between them, despite little petty arguments that they would have from time to time, like most couples do. But as time goes on, she goes ahead and she's basically just nagging him to marry her. And she's like, John, please, 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 I really want to get married. And he's hesitant at first, like basically brushing her off, and this is pissing her off. And so for some reason, she began to plan on getting revenge. And so she went ahead and she videotaped some of these items that he had allegedly stole from his job, and she sent it over to them. She sent it over to his boss actually, and it was just a few medical tools, but they ended up firing John. After 17 long years, they fired him. And of course, he was furious behind this, and so he came home and he kicked her ass out. All right, so after he goes ahead and kicks her out, Katherine, you know, she goes back home. She pops up, she's like, hey guys. And, you know, they live in this relatively small town, and so word spread like wildfire. Here we have this wife that basically just snitched on her husband being petty, but as toxic relationships, you know, occur, it was not long before she was back with him. But this time it would be under John's terms, because although some time had passed, nothing had changed at all between them. Arguments was getting more and more bad. It was to the point where his friends was like, bro, if you're gonna stay with her, you cannot hang out with us, period. We do not want that crazy bitch around us. So I'm guessing that's how unbearable she was. Now this is basically just us going down her history, like her past, just to maybe get a little background history and a little feel of maybe why she was the way that she was. And so we are going to take it to the year 1973, where Katherine meets David. Killet was a very, very heavy drinker, and he had went through a lot in his life, and that's what basically made him turn to alcoholism. David was basically trying to suppress all those traumatic events that he had went through. He became increasingly angry. One thing led to another, and then he ended up losing his job. But soon after, he did begin working with Katherine at the same job she was at, cutting up those meat whatever, and he was actually very, very close with Katherine's brother. Oftentimes his mouth would get him into some trouble when he was at work, and Katherine would basically have to step in and defend him, not just with words. She was actually fighting for him. A year later, they ended up getting married. So they of course went ahead and had a little ceremony, and Katherine had actually requested for them to ride in on this motorcycle. It was called a pillion, and at their wedding, Barbara had actually pulled David aside because she wanted to give him, I guess, a little quote-unquote pep talk, but it was really just giving him advice on Katherine. Barbara basically told David to run. He said that old lady told him to watch out. You rub her the wrong way, you get on her bad side, you cheat on her, you hurt her, anything, she will kill you. Barbara basically told David that he was basically making the wrong choice and he was fucked. And even though those were some very, very wild statements, she knew her daughter like the back of her hand, because that very night, Katherine and David had got into a scuffle. And I wouldn't even say a scuffle because I don't know what happened verbatim, but Katherine tried strangling him that night. But according to Katherine, she had a valid reason as to why she tried to strangle her newly husband. Now, her reasoning for trying to strangle him is because David fell asleep 3 times while they were trying to have sexy time. That was the reason why Katherine strangled him. Well, tried to strangle him. But this little duo was very, very toxic. I wouldn't even say the duo Katherine was very, very toxic. Like, she was burning this man's clothes, like, while she was actively pregnant. His clothes, his shoes. She even hit him with a frying pan one night. I guess David came home late. He was at, like, some darting tournament or whatever, and she hit this man in the back of his head with a freaking frying pan. Like, I didn't even know darting tournaments even existed, but the fact that he wasn't cheating and you knew where he was at, it's just disgusting to even carry on that way. This man booked it out of her house and basically just collapsed in front of their neighbor's home. And you guys, his skull was actually fractured behind this situation. Like, she had actually fractured this man's skull. Like, I can't, whatever. So the police ended up getting involved, of course, but Katherine, I'm sure you can guess, talked him out of pressing charges against her. And I'm not even sure if he was even the one to call the police in the first place. I'm sure he wasn't. I'm sure the neighbors was the one to call the police, and they showed up and attempted to arrest her, and the rest is history. And so Katherine had ended up giving birth to their first child that they shared together in the year of 1976. And they went on to name this little baby girl that they had Melissa Ann. But David and Katherine did not stay together after little Mamas was born, because David eventually just got tired and just fed up with all that physical abuse, and he ended up shacking up with this lady in Queensland. And of course, Katherine was not happy with this at all. And so according to multiple accounts, she was seen the next day, and I'm sure it's not the very next day, but she had been seen shortly after David had left her, walking around with the newborn in the stroller. And it was said that she was just basically walking around with the stroller so carelessly and just basically throwing it around. And shortly after giving birth, she was diagnosed with postpartum depression, and so they admitted her to a hospital so she can go ahead and be treated. But soon after Katherine was actually released from the hospital, and she had only spent like a few weeks in there. But after she had been released, she had actually had an incident where she placed little poor Miss Melissa on railroad train tracks just a few minutes before the train had been passing. And while this had been happening, there was a bunch of bystanders, just watching, and there was this homeless man that actually was the only one to intervene. His name was Old Ted, and he had actually been the one to save Melissa. And from the multiple people that had been standing just basically watching, they said that this had happened, like basically Melissa had been saved just a few minutes before the train passed. But Melissa was nowhere to be found, because Melissa wheeling axes and going into town, basically waving the axe to multiple people, threatening their life. And so the police, of course, came and detained her to get her off of the streets, and they placed her into the same hospital that she was placed into before so she can get evaluated and admitted. But I'm guessing that Katherine and the doctors as well felt like she didn't need much time to recover after putting her baby, her 2-month-old, on train tracks. And so she was able to sign herself out only 24 hours after being admitted, literally the very next day. But we know that Katherine did not recover whatsoever. And to be 100% honest, I don't even know who signed off for this lady to be able to leave and go back into society. Please tell me why a few days after this lady is released, she grabs a random old lady and she slashes this lady's face. She did this demanding that this random woman drive her to Queensland so she can find David. I legit just want to know where her children was in all of this, like with all of this happening. But the only reason why this random lady had even got away from her was because they had to stop at a gas station or whatever, and she was able to escape. But Katherine was not finished, because when the police arrived, she had an entire new hostage. Like, this lady literally had a damn knife to a child's throat. It had actually gotten to the point where the police had to go ahead and attack Katherine with some brooms in order for her to go ahead and disarm herself. And it's like, honestly, I just cannot fathom and deal with all of these like scenarios and situations that was occurring by the hands of her. But actually, after the situation, she was readmitted to the hospital, a different hospital this time. It was called the Morissette, and it was, of course, located also in Australia. And the thing is, she was not even, thank God, she was not even discreet about wanting to hurt these people. When she had finally been interviewed by the police, she had told them her intentions, basically, what her intentions were to kill one of the mechanics that was actually responsible for fixing Mr. David's car. And then after she killed the mechanic, her plan was to go ahead and find David and his mother and go ahead and execute them as well. And so, of course, the police told David this information, and David got out of Dodge. He packed him, his girlfriend, and I believe his mother did tag along as well, and they moved to Aberdeen. Now get this, after she had been thrown into the psychiatric hospital, she was released not too long after, and she was released into the care of her mother-in-law, which was David's mother, and of course David. So I'm sure she was happy with what happened and how things turned out, because this is something that she wanted all along. And so they end up moving, David, obviously his mother, and Katherine, and she ends up getting a job back, her old job back at the abattoir, I believe it's pronounced. And this was just the job that she was going ahead and cutting up the animal organs, if you guys can remember. And so despite all the things that Katherine and David had went through, they ended up having yet another daughter, and this time this baby girl had been named Natasha Marie. So very, very similar to the other little girl name. I think it was Melissa Marie or something like that. But they went ahead and had this baby girl on March 6th, 1980. 4 years later, though, Katherine had ended up leaving David. Now, it's unclear why she ended up leaving and moving back to her home, but she did end up moving back with her parents. And when she did not stay there for long. Soon after, she began renting her own apartment. And so now she's on her own. She's independent Kathy or whatever. And I mentioned earlier, she did get her job back cutting the organs. And at this job, she had ended up injuring herself. And so Kathy just had to go ahead and take one of those medical leaves, but she was paid a disability pension, and so she was, basically able to keep up with her rent. The Australian government had actually went ahead and gave her first priority, disabled priority for housing. Now let's move on to the events of that day. In the year of 2000, February to be exact, this lady basically attacked Mr. John Price with a knife to his chest. And this was not just one event that occurred, it was multiple occasions. And so, of course, the length of these attacks was unknown, and we are unclear of how long it was going on for, but eventually Mr. Price got tired of her and got tired of all of the toxicness, and eventually again he ended up kicking her ass to the curb. On February 28th, this was the day he had finally went ahead to go and get a good old restraining order against Katherine Knight. Like, this man was just fully on his way to work one day and was like, yeah, I know this crazy biatch is going to mess with me again today, so I'm going to go ahead and just get a restraining order on her. And that's what he did. Now, of course, this restraining order was not just for John, it was also for his daughters as well, rightfully so. And so he leaves the courtroom and he goes to work, and he, goes on about his day, and he ends up connecting with one of his coworkers, and he tells them, listen, if I don't come in tomorrow, you already know what's up. Basically insinuating that Katherine was going to do something to him. And I am guessing that his coworker must have sensed that something was going down, because they had basically just been begging him and pleading with him to not go back home that night. But Price is like, no, if I don't go back, she might do something to harm my kids. And my whole thing is, why would you still have someone actively like that around your children? He did. So moving on with the story, he gets home. And when he gets home, everything is quiet. Katherine is home and she does have a guest, but the children are not there. So at the moment, she is kid-free because she did go ahead and send them off, I believe, to a sleepover. So John's like, hey, where's the kids? And she tells him, oh, I sent them off to a sleepover. And John thinks to himself, like, oh, okay, so I have some free time. Let me go ahead and hang out with a friend. And so he does, and he decides to go ahead and hang out with his neighbor. And so he's hanging out with his friend, doing what friends do. And he's hanging out over there till like 11 p.m. that night. Now, all the events from earlier that day is unclear. We do not know what happened, but what we do have is some receipts from her purchasing lingerie earlier that day, and then they have proof of her videotaping the children. And since that video had been put out, that proof, and people had just basically been dissecting those videos, they feel as if at the time Katherine had been being really cruel and rude to her children, making very insensitive comments. Now, me personally, I did not see those videos of how she was interacting with her children, nor did I see the videos of her making those comments, so I can't really spectate too much on that. But Katherine does arrive back to Price's house, and at this time he is sleeping. She ends up doing a usual night routine, cleaning up the house, cleaning herself up, and then going ahead and watching some TV. And after that, it was said that she went to bed. It had also been reported that after that, I guess she woke up like in the middle of the night, or woke up before Price nevertheless, and she attempts to wake him up, and she wants some sexy time. And so she's like, come on, John, let's go. And they end up having sexy time. And after that, he goes back to sleep. And then 6 that morning, their neighbor had came out of the house so they can go ahead and retrieve their mail, just do their usual morning routine. And he sees John's car still in the driveway. And this is not really normal to him because John usually goes to work, so his car should not be in the driveway, but it is. So he's like, this is kind of weird and odd, so maybe he might have stayed home that day. So as I mentioned earlier, his car had still been in the driveway, and so that indicated obviously that he did not attend work that day. It had also been confirmed, his absence, by his employer coming to his home to basically do a wellness check, because he basically did a no call, no show. And so when he arrived, he saw the neighbor, present, trying to get into the apartment, and he's, banging on the door and whatnot. And so his employer decides to join in. So at this point, they're banging on the doors, they're, walking around the house, banging on the walls, just basically trying to get his attention. And I do have a cold, so please excuse my voice at this time and bear with me. But upon looking through his bedroom, they realized that this man had blood all over his home. And so, of course, ding, 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 red flags are going off. This is a man who, 1, did not show up for work, 2, was not answering the door for all these attempts for people to get in, and now there's blood seeming to be all over his apartment. They decided to call the police, as they should. And so the police shows up, and the police obviously attempts to get in. And then when they can't, they go ahead and they break the back door down. And I am sure upon arrival, the police knew exactly what they had been walking into or suspected, because they have been working with cases like this for a while. So I'm sure they were, prepared to see the body. But the neighbor and the employer, I just feel so bad for the gruesome scene that they walked into. But of course, upon breaking the door down, they enter the home and they see his body. But he isn't alone, because Katherine is there, but she's passed out. She's completely comatose according to them, and this is because she took a large amount of pills. Now, of course, none of us were there. We can only speculate as to what happened, and due to blood evidence and some of what Katherine had told the police during interviews and whatnot, the accounts of that day basically went like this. Katherine attacked him while he had been sleeping. If you guys can remember, she did go into his home while he had been sleeping. She washed off, did all that stuff, cleaned up, and then went to quote-unquote bed. But this girl had actually went ahead and attacked this man with a butcher knife while he had been sleeping. So according to the blood analysis, the reports and the blood evidence that they had collected, that John had actually been awoken up from his peaceful slumber, and he was attacked by Katherine. And during this attack, he obviously got up and tried to, escape her and turn on the light so he can navigate better through the home and escape. And that's how the blood got all over the walls, obviously. And he actually was being chased by this woman throughout their home that they shared together. And he had actually made it to the front door, and for some reason he stumbled back. Maybe he lost too much blood from his wounds, or she dragged him back in. They're not too sure how he got back into the home, but he basically got back into the home after he almost escaped, and that is where he succumbed to his injuries, passing away from his injuries due to this crazy mad woman. And so I am guessing before the police was called, he had actually left the residence and withdrew some money from his account from the ATM, $1,000. And the autopsy for him had also reported that he had been stabbed 37 times, front and back. And several hours after he had passed, trigger warning, she skinned this man, proceeding to hang him from a meat hook as if he was some type of wild catch or something. She then goes ahead and decapitates him and cooks his body parts. And big trigger warning, I am going to put it in the title so you guys know upon clicking the video, but I hope you guys are not eating. She served this man with carrots, beetroot, potatoes, cabbage, yellow squash, zucchini. I don't know if I said pumpkin, but pumpkin. All that mixed with some gravy. Like, child, this lady is so sick. Like, I honestly have no words. Like, the sick ass lady literally served this man on plates with like little notes as if she was playing a sadistic game. And so each of these notes that she placed, it had each of his children's names on them, and her intentions was to serve this man to his children, basically. Like, honestly, why was that a thought? And so upon their search, the police searching, they found on the back lawn some of the food. It had been just basically thrown onto the back lawn, and they speculated that Katherine had actually tried it and she was not pleased at all, or she maybe had got disgusted during doing this and she just basically threw it back there. But Katherine, Miss Kathy, she claims that she has no recollection of what occurred that night. His head had literally been found in the pot like some fucking stew or something. It had been paired with vegetables and the pot was still warm as if she had literally just made it. So hopefully nobody else had that stew besides her. But they had concluded, based on some evidence that they had gathered, that she had actually cooked this meal during the morning hours. And it had also been reported that sometime after that she had actually placed his body in a certain position to where his arm was basically resting on this like 2-liter soda bottle, and then she crossed his legs for whatever reason. In their reports, they claimed that this showed an act of defilement from Katherine. She had also actually been sane enough to go ahead and write a letter, and she left this blood-stained and flesh-stained letter on top of a photo of Price. And this is what the note read. Time you got back for raping my daughter, which daughter and raping was spelled wrong. You to Beck Price from Loss. For little John. Now play with little dick John Price. And that is what the letter said, word for word, no exaggeration. On March 21st, 2001, Knight was charged with murdering John Price. She initially attempted to plead guilty to manslaughter, but that had been denied. When the trial had been going on, Justice Barry O'Keefe, he had gave the jurors an option to leave when they had been basically explaining what Katherine had done and showing the graphic photos from the crime scene. And 5 of the jurors that had been on trial, they was like, yeah, let me get out of here. I don't want to see that. Understandably, rightfully so, it is a case, and sometimes they do pick random people, and so I can, understand why someone would not want to have that image just buried in their head. Because even when we see certain horror movies and stuff like that, even though we know that those are not real, the image is still buried into our heads, into our memory. Several more of the jurors had actually dropped out when the judge and the witness list had been actually exposed. Of course, this caused for the trial to be adjourned for the following day. Shortly after this, Knight's attorney did pull aside the judge just so they can have a little one-on-one chat with each other. Of course, at the time, no one knew what they had been talking about, but the following day when the trial did begin, Katherine had went ahead and changed her plea. So before, she had pleaded not guilty and was trying to go for the manslaughter, but This time she had been pleading guilty, and so the jury had been dismissed completely. After O'Keefe had went ahead and adjourned the trial, he actually went ahead and scheduled for her to get a psychiatric assessment. He wanted to make sure that she knew exactly what she had been doing and what she had been, basically agreeing to and accepting. Her defense, of course, wanted to go ahead and claim amnesia and also disassociation, basically wanting to stick up for her and, stand beside her. But this claim had actually been supported by multiple psychiatric therapists. But overall, with all the agreement and the test, they did go ahead and declare her sane. 2 psychiatrists, though, did conclude that she had been suffering from BPD, also commonly known as borderline personality disorder. Despite her going ahead and accepting her plea, she still did not accept the consequences of what she had done. She hadn't even wanted to be there. Like, she requested for her to not be there while this had all been going down, but that had been refused, rightfully so. So it's like she had been running from hearing the facts of basically what she had done. She even had to be sedated when they began talking about how she skinned him because of how hysterical and erratic she had been acting. The judge went ahead and stated that she showed no remorse and she deserved a severe penalty, which I definitely agree with. I feel as if she tried to use mental health and play on that, and she really thought that that was going to get her maybe a lighter sentence or something. He went ahead and marked for her to never be eligible for parole and never get out, sentencing her to life in prison. And this marked history because she was the first woman that had that sort of sentencing in Australian history. So the things that she done was so horrible that she had been the first woman to have ever been imposed those kind of details within her sentencing. That is crazy. In the year of 2006, June to be exact, she definitely went ahead and tried to appeal her sentencing, claiming that she felt as if her sentencing was too severe, as if what she had done had not been severe in itself. But of course, this appeal was dismissed. They felt that the crime that she had committed had just been too much for her to go ahead and rebrand, and then just go back into society, which I definitely agree with. I do not feel that any type of reform can ever help her to get back out into the normal world. Katherine is currently serving her term at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center, and she's basically top dog in there, reference from Wentworth if you guys ever watched it, but she's basically top dog in there, taking leadership role. She had not had any records in there. She had not been in any trouble, not receiving any additional charges, and so I guess she was on her best behavior in there, basically probably because she wants to get the parole and she wants to get out of jail. But with the judge, who knows, he might turn it over. It might be a new judge on her case, but as far as the judge is concerned, she's staying in there. I honestly do not know how Australia's prison system works or how the justice system works, but I can assure you that this lady definitely does not need to get out, and she definitely does need some psychiatric help. This case truly disturbed me, and I feel bad for all the family members that basically had to sit through this trial and hear about their family members' dismemberment and gruesome murder. It's honestly sickening, and my heart just goes out to them and also to her children as well, especially with the ones that she shared with John Price. This case was truly disturbing. It was definitely one not for Thanksgiving. But this is the end of the video, and if you guys did watch until the end, I do want you guys to go ahead and comment your thoughts, because this was certainly a sick one. And if you guys have any recommendations on any cases that you would like for me to cover, you can go ahead and contact me in my business email that will be located in either the description box or the first comment, and I will catch you guys in the next one.